Back in 1948, Israel was just getting started, but its Arab neighbors were not too thrilled about it. They tried to squash the whole thing by attacking Israel, but they didn't succeed. One of the key moments was this Fallujah pocket standoff, where some young Egyptian and Israeli officers were trying to figure things out. Among them were Yitzhak Rabin and Gamal Abdel Nasser, who would later become pretty big names. For the Jewish people, the creation of Israel was a dream come true, especially after the nightmare of the Holocaust. But for the Palestinians, it was a total disaster. Hundreds of thousands of them were forced to leave their homes, and they couldn't go back. They call it al-Nakba or the catastrophe, and it's still a very sensitive topic even today. The Arabs who lost to Israel were not happy campers, to say the least. They felt humiliated and betrayed, and some of them even took over their own countries in military coups. Syria was having a whole bunch of these, and Egypt had its own drama too. Nasser, this big-shot leader in Egypt, defied some big countries in the Suez Crisis and became the hero of the Arab world. On the other side, Israel was not just sitting around twiddling their thumbs. Rabin, this young military hotshot, was climbing the ranks, becoming a big shot himself. They were constantly on edge, knowing that another war was probably around the corner. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. It's kind of like a messy family feud, but on a national scale. Everyone had their reasons to be mad, and no one was really ready to forgive and forget. And that's the setup for the big showdown in 1967, a six-day war that changed everything in the Middle East. So, during the 1950s and 1960s, Israel and its Arab neighbors weren't exactly the best of friends. The Cold War, which was this big political tug-of-war between the United States and the Soviet Union, made things even more complicated. The Soviet Union was helping Egypt with its air force, while Israel was cozying up to the United States, although it wasn't their top military aid provider at the time. Israel was also getting some military gear from France and Britain. Since its birth in 1948, Israel had been working non-stop to make sure it could defend itself. They even absorbed over 1 million immigrants, and military service was a big part of turning these newcomers into real Israelis. They built a super-fast and deadly military force and were even getting close to having their own nuclear weapons. The Israelis born in the country, called Sabras, were all about not making the same mistakes as Jews had in the past. They were ready to fight back, even if it meant being the first to throw a punch. On the other side, the Egypt, led by Nasser, who was all about building this big Arab pride movement that was supposed to get back at Israel. He had this top guy, Amer, keeping the army in check, making sure everyone was happy and loyal. Egypt was feeling pretty confident, but it was actually stuck in this not-so-great war in Yemen, kind of like how the US had been stuck in Vietnam. Nasser couldn't find anyone better than Amer to fix things. Syria was in a similar boat, with their army also playing politics and being buddies with the Soviet Union. They were having a bunch of coups, like musical chairs for generals. The Arab countries were all about talking unity and nationalism, but in reality, they weren't exactly all on the same page. There was a lot of worry and paranoia about plots and revolutions, especially from the monarchies in Jordan and Saudi Arabia. Speaking of Jordan, their king, Hussein, had this history with secret talks with Israel. His grandpa had even talked about splitting the land with the Jewish Agency back in 1948. Things got pretty intense when his grandpa was assassinated, and he became king at just 16. Jordan was dealing with its own set of challenges, mainly a desert and a big population of restless Palestinian refugees. So, it was a messy situation with a lot of distrust and political games going on between these countries. The war in 1967 was a result of a long build-up of tension and violent conflicts along the borders between Arab countries and Israel. While the border between Egypt and Israel was relatively calm, the major trouble arose on Israel's northern border with Syria. The two sides were in constant disputes over territory, and Syria was attempting to divert the River Jordan away from Israel's water grid. On top of this, Syria was providing shelter to Palestinian guerrillas, who were carrying out raids into Israel. The Western powers were pretty clear about which side was stronger in the Middle East just before the war in 1967. The U.S. military's Joint Chiefs of Staff were confident that Israel would not be easily challenged by any combination of Arab states for at least the next 5 years. In January 1967, the British defense attaché in Tel Aviv reported that the Israeli army was more prepared for war than ever before. They had strong leadership, extensive training, advanced equipment, and a well-developed service structure. The Israeli soldiers were well-trained, tough, and self-reliant, with a strong fighting spirit and a willingness to defend their country at any cost. The tensions were further fueled by border skirmishes, with Palestinian guerrillas managing to breach the border fence. Israel considered these guerrillas as terrorists and believed that responding with strong force was necessary to deter them and prevent further attacks. Firstly, a large Israeli raid into the Jordanian-occupied West Bank targeted the village of Samua in November 1966, following a landmine attack inside Israel. This caused an uproar among Palestinians in the West Bank, with King Hussein of Jordan feeling a growing sense of threat to his throne. He feared a potential coup by pro-Nasser officers in the army, which Israel could use as a pretext to take over the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Tensions escalated further on the Israel-Syrian border, with a full-scale air and artillery battle between Israel and Syria on the 7th of April, 1967. Israel emerged victorious, leading to a mood of self-congratulation in Israel. However, some senior figures were alarmed by the growing tensions, and the situation seemed to indicate that Israel might be planning a larger military move. An exaggerated news agency report quoting an Israeli military official hinted at the possibility of Israel taking military action to topple the Syrian regime, if Syrian terrorists continued to conduct raids inside Israel. This report was taken seriously both in Syria and in the Israeli press, adding fuel to the fire. The situation took a dramatic turn when the Soviet Union issued a warning to Cairo on May 13, 1967, that Israel was massing troops on the border with Syria and would attack within a week. The exact reasons for the Soviet Union's intervention have been debated, with some historians suggesting that the USSR deliberately instigated the crisis to thwart Israel's nuclear weapons plans and to create trouble for the United States. In 1967, the tensions in the region reached a critical point, and both Israel and its Arab neighbors dived headlong into a crisis that many had anticipated for years. In the lead-up to the conflict, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser took a series of bold and risky moves, increasing the tension and pressure in the region. Nasser's response to the Soviet warning was to put Egypt's army on full alert for war. Despite the Chief of Operations, Lieutenant General Anwar al-Qadi's concerns about the army's condition due to its involvement in Yemen, Field Marshal Omer assured him that fighting was not the plan, it was intended as a demonstration against Israel's threats to Syria. The crisis escalated when Egypt expelled UN peacekeepers and moved troops into the Sinai Desert. Nasser, using his radio station Sawt al-Arab, intensified the rhetoric, issuing menacing threats to Israel. He then raised the stakes further by banning Israeli shipping from the Straits of Tiran, effectively reimposing the blockade of the port of Eilat. Nasser's dramatic announcement at an airbase in the Sinai, challenging Israel, was accompanied by a carefully crafted image aimed at portraying him as the strong and resolute leader of the Arab world. This move put immense pressure on the international community and particularly on the United States, which responded with the offer of a visit by Vice President Hubert Humphrey if the crisis was averted. The United Nations Secretary-General U Thant, en route to Cairo on a peace mission, concluded that unless a solution was found to the blockade of Eilat, war was inevitable. The mounting pressure on all sides created a tense and volatile atmosphere, paving the way for the outbreak of the conflict. After Egyptian President Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran, Israel responded swiftly by ordering a full mobilization of its forces. Within 48 hours, approximately 250,000 men were ready for deployment, with most Israeli men under the age of 50 in some form of military uniform due to compulsory military service. The mounting pressure took a toll on General Rabin, who became overwhelmed by the weight of the impending conflict. Despite his concerns, he persisted in his duties until he suffered a nervous collapse, requiring nearly a day of rest before returning to work. In an attempt to avert full-scale war, international diplomatic efforts were initiated, with Israel's foreign minister, Abba Eban, seeking urgent support from President Johnson in Washington. Eban aimed to secure Johnson's approval for Israel's defensive actions, recalling the US's previous condemnation of Israel as an aggressor during the 1956 conflict with Egypt. President Johnson cautioned Israel against initiating hostilities, assuring Eban that an imminent Egyptian attack was not likely, and if it did occur, Israel would be able to repel it effectively. Johnson suggested exploring the possibility of reopening the Straits of Tiran with the help of a multinational naval task force, but requested time to evaluate its feasibility. Despite the military's readiness for action, Israel agreed to move at the pace suggested by the United States. However, the generals grew increasingly impatient with the delays and diplomatic maneuvers. They were deeply concerned about the broader implications of Nasser's actions, perceiving his movements and the United Arab world's stance as a direct threat to Israel's borders. In the midst of escalating tensions, Nasser, who had been a dominant figure in the Arab world since 1956, solidified his leadership position by taking a strong stand against Israel. During a press conference in Cairo on May 28, he emphasized the connection between the crisis in the Sinai and the Straits of Tiran and Israel's perceived aggression toward the Palestinians. Nasser's bold rhetoric included warnings of potential Israeli actions against Syria. This situation left Jordan's King Hussein in a difficult position. Despite his lack of trust in Nasser, he recognized that the West Bank was a prime target for Israel. Seeking to ensure the survival of his regime, Hussein made the decision to reconcile with Nasser. He believed that abstaining from the war might lead to an internal uprising among the Palestinians, which could potentially result in the collapse of his rule. Alternatively, if Jordan engaged in the conflict, the presence of Egyptian air support might delay Israel's advance into the West Bank, allowing the United Nations to enforce a ceasefire. Thus, on May 30, King Hussein flew to Cairo and struck a deal with Nasser. His return to Amman was met with ecstatic crowds attempting to lift his Mercedes to carry it back to the palace. Despite the outward displays of jubilation, Hussein was aware that the people's adulation stemmed from Nasser's acceptance of him, not the other way around. Reflecting on his decision, Hussein later acknowledged the inevitability of war, his anticipation of defeat, and the critical need for Jordan to navigate a delicate balance to prevent internal strife. In the lead-up to the conflict, Israel's military leaders were confident that they would emerge victorious if they could fight on their own terms. However, due to strict military censorship, these optimistic assessments were kept private. Meanwhile, Arab radio stations and propaganda in Israeli newspapers intensified, stoking a sense of foreboding among the population. The echoes of the Holocaust were still fresh, leading to a tense and ominous atmosphere in the country. The apprehensive mood was exacerbated by a series of unsettling preparations by the government, including the stockpiling of coffins, the consecration of parks as emergency cemeteries by rabbis, and the donation of tens of thousands of pints of blood. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol's hesitant and faltering broadcast to the nation on May 28 further contributed to the unease. Israel's military leaders were particularly critical of Eshkol, perceiving him as embodying the weakness of the Jewish diaspora. This sentiment was fueled by a perceived generational gap, with the younger, native-born Israeli generals viewing themselves as the frontier generation or cowboys. Eshkol's resignation as Minister of Defense in favor of the charismatic and one-eyed war hero, Moshe Dayan, reflected the changing dynamics within the leadership. Moshe Dayan, known for his swashbuckling persona, had emphasized the necessity of always being prepared and armed, underscoring the essential philosophy that Israel's survival depended on unwavering strength and determination. Nasser, the leader of Egypt, was taking a significant risk by engaging in brinkmanship, as his country's military capabilities were imbalanced, with a strong air force but a weaker army. Despite international attempts to defuse the escalating crisis, such as the proposed Red Sea Regatta, these efforts had failed, leaving limited options for resolution. Israel's military leaders presented a compelling case for war to the Cabinet Defense Committee, stressing that a delay in action would only make the situation more challenging. Meir Amit, the head of Israel's intelligence agency Mossad, had traveled to Washington, D.C. and recommended a swift military operation. His meeting with U.S. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara confirmed that the U.S. would not intervene to prevent the impending conflict. Upon his return to Israel, Amit, along with the Washington ambassador, Abe Harman, and other key ministers, met with Prime Minister Levi Eshkol to discuss the timing of the war. While some advocated for waiting, others, including Moshe Dayan, emphasized the urgency of preemptive action to prevent potential casualties. The decision to go to war was made, and the Israeli cabinet officially ratified it the next morning. In Egypt, Nasser anticipated an Israeli attack based on the movement of an Iraqi armored division toward the Jordan Valley and Israel, understanding that Israel would not tolerate a significant shift in the balance of forces. By 7:40 on the 5th of June, Ezra Weizman, stationed at the Air Force Command Center in the Israeli Ministry of Defense in Tel Aviv, was consumed with suspense. The success of the Israeli war plan, known as Operation Focus, hinged on executing a surprise attack to neutralize the Arab air forces, beginning with Egypt.